Why hold me to this light?
Is it wrong
Why greatness?
to want greatness for you?
Is goodness not enough?
On a gray, misty Christmas morning, a hulking supernatural knight interrupts a gathering of King Arthur's Round Table and challenges all in attendance to a game. The nature of the game seems simple enough. If any man will step into the ring with him and succeeds in landing a blow, he may have the giant green axe that the knight carries. But he must also agree that in 1 year's time he must travel to the Green Chapel to allow the knight to return the blow that was given. Among those in attendance is Gawain, nephew to the king and a young man who ought to be more than what he is. Despite his lineage and privilege, Gawain has done basically nothing with his advantages. He still lives with his mother and fritters away his days and nights in hedonistic indulgence at bars and brothels. A certain amount of this kind of thing is to be expected, after all, boys will be boys, but Gawain has taken it past any reasonable limit, and it is beginning to strain people's patience. In modern parlance, Gawain is a boy, an analog for the kind of arrested development that is so commonly seen in young men in the modern world. This is something that the director, David Lowery, was not shy about owning in interviews, even going so far as to say that he modeled this retelling on his own life. To quote, "It became a drama about a mother and son in a way that I hadn't intended. All of a sudden I was writing about my own relationship with my mom, and the fact that I lived under her roof for far longer than I should have. I had failure to launch syndrome, and she eventually had to force me out." As far as his more career-minded concerns, Gawain puts off all of his training in knighthood, telling himself and everyone else, "I've got time."
What?
You and I?
Yeah. Not yet.
Better hurry up.
I've got time. I've got lots of time.
I've got time. The perennial trap of youth, that there is plenty of time. So much so that it seems impossible that one could simply fail to live up to their potential. And despite the fact that he is no longer all that young, he is too confident, too assured of his eventual success. But that confidence is shaken on Christmas Day when Arthur calls Gawain to his side and asks his nephew to gift him with a tale of his deeds so that Arthur might know him. And in that moment, Gawain is forced to admit that he has no stories to tell. For what may be the first time, he is forced to take stock of his life, and he finds that he has nothing to offer his king. And maybe it is this realization that spurs Gawain into action when the Green Knight appears and gives his challenge. The knight himself has connections with the pre-Christian polytheistic pagan traditions of Europe, traditions which were largely animistic and deeply intertwined with nature, details which are reflected in the knight's green color and him seeming to be carved out of living wood. The color green is itself significant and one of the most widely recognized motifs of the film, representing not just nature but the forces of time and decay. And the knight is designed to resemble the pagan deity, the Green Man, who represented the forces of nature, death, and also rebirth. Though she's never identified as such, Gawain's mother is the witch Morgan Le Fay, and she is the one who summoned the Green Knight. In the lore, Morgan was a sorceress trained by Merlin, but Lowery's reimagining adds to this lore by invoking the religious history of Europe and making Morgan a practitioner of the old religion of the region. And she offers this challenge to the newly dominant Christianity on its most important holy day. He bears a branch of mistletoe, which normally has strong associations with peace in Roman traditions, but among the Celtic Druids, it signified nature's vitality and its ability to eternally renew itself. And so there are layers of intersecting symbolism at work when the Green Knight strides into Arthur's court on Christmas morning. Not only is he a representative of the land's original religion, he also represents the impermanence of all things, the futility of all human endeavor, and by extension, the inevitable end not just of Arthur's life, but of his kingdom, his legacy, and the things that he has placed his faith in. And as he holds the branch over his head, he creates a dual symbol. On one level, signaling that he comes in peace, but on a deeper level, declaring the banner of his own triumph. And as a representative of the inevitability of time, he is already victorious over Arthur, who has grown so old and frail that he can barely wield his own sword. Still, when the challenge is offered, Arthur stands without hesitation, as if wanting to meet it himself. And surely if he were a younger man, he would.
Though my will longs to leap across this table and meet thee, my body will not follow.
But despite all of his greatness, despite the train of glories that rides on every mention of his name, Arthur knows he's grown too old to meet this. And in this way, the Green Knight, the ambassador of decay and the fragility of all things, has already dealt a blow to Arthur. He looks around the room for someone who is willing to step forward, but none of the men stand. Instead, they glance nervously at each other. Game or not, there's actually a lot at stake in this moment for Arthur. This test of courage against Arthur's knights creates a question of his legacy. And in these few tense moments when the knights hesitate, Arthur faces the possibility that he has failed to raise up any heir to his kingdom, failed to produce anyone worthy of his legacy, and will leave behind only a generation of cowards. And it's at this moment that Gawain raises his voice. At this point in the story, in the original 14th century poem, it is even more explicit that the knights have failed a test of courage, and the Green Knight mocks them for it. Afterwards, a young and still powerful Arthur leaps to take the challenge himself, but Gawain intervenes, and when he does, what he says is, "Let this adventure be mine." But no sooner has he spoken than he realizes that he has no weapon, and in that moment the sound of a sword being unsheathed can be heard, and Arthur rises to offer Excalibur itself to this young, deedless non-knight. I'll assume that you remember how the rest of that scene played out. And maybe it was just a game, but even games can turn deadly when the stakes run high. After the Green Knight leaves, Gawain spends the next year coasting on the fame of his deed, being celebrated at the taverns and assuring himself and anyone else who asks that that was the end of the story, that it was just a trick. Till one night, when a drunk and muddied Gawain makes his way home from the tavern, he finds Arthur waiting at his mother's house. The Arthur before him is a far cry from the man depicted by his legends. He's frail, decrepit even. He complains that his tooth hurts, again emphasizing the sheer materiality of existence and the decay of the body. He asks if Gawain intends to make his appointment with the Green Knight. "I thought it was only a game," Gawain says. "Yes," Arthur answers, "but it is not complete." "Why hold me to this light?" asks Gawain, who feels that he's being asked to perform something patently absurd. Die for a game? Who could possibly demand such a thing? What possible benefit could be served by him riding out and potentially laying down his life over nothing more than a game? It defies all reason. But Arthur responds with probably the finest line in the film. "Is it wrong," he asks, "to want greatness for you?" In an earlier version of the script, this conversation between Gawain and Arthur goes even further and creates an explicit connection between greatness and masculinity, having Arthur tell Gawain straight out, "You are not the man you should be." He may have a point. In earlier versions of the script, Lawry was even more explicit about Gawain's failings. When invited by another knight to join a battle, Gawain refuses, stating plainly, "I want to live." And when he's told by Essel that she is pregnant, and that it is probably his. The theater version doesn't make this very clear, but Essel is a prostitute. He takes basically no ownership, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. His relationship with his mother is also much more fraught, her displeasure at his continued dalliances and immaturity much more palpable. And while in the film, Gawain gets a hero's send-off for his quest, in the previous version of the story, told by the script, he waits so long that Arthur eventually loses his patience and has him taken by the castle guards and unceremoniously booted from the city. He's provided with a horse and supplies, and his mother, who in this version is not Morgana, tells him, "Go now, be a man of your word, come back to me strong with your head held high." In a lot of ways, Lowry's reimagining is really a story about one young man just trying to make good. But it's also more than that. "This is how silly men perish," Essel says when she hears of Gawain's intention to finish the game. "Or how brave men become great," he says in return.
Why greatness? Why is goodness not enough?
The most popular interpretations of this movie always wind up back at this scene, and the conclusion for most of them is that Essel is essentially correct here, that goodness ought to be enough. On that reading, Gawain's mistake is that he desires greatness in order to gratify his ego, when it ought to be enough for him to just be a decent human being, TM. This is familiar thematic terrain for modern audiences. From Ironclaw to Death of a Salesman, we're used to stories decrying masculine vainglory, where men's desire for acclaim and respect are turned into the seeds of their undoing. Interestingly, in an earlier version of the script, Essel's line was given to Arthur. During the scene of his visit to Gawain's home, when Gawain says that he's perhaps not meant for greatness, it is Arthur who asks, "Then can I at least hope for goodness?" And I've always found it interesting that Essel isn't the one who's vindicated by the film's ending. It's Arthur. It's Arthur who has his faith in Gawain justified, which leads me to believe that it's worth taking a deeper look at what we mean by these words. What truly is the difference between goodness and greatness? In 1958, the American psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg presented a doctoral dissertation titled The Development of Modes of Thinking and Choices in Years 10 to 16. This humble title would eventually expand into his theory of moral development, which he would eventually present in a series of essays published in 3 volumes from 1981 to 1984. Kohlberg's research involved presenting people with a moral dilemma. A man needs a drug to save his wife's life, but he does not have the money to pay for it, and the pharmacist refuses to allow him to buy it at a reduced price or on credit. Participants were then asked whether the husband should steal the medicine or not, and to provide some rationale for their response. Kohlberg was less interested in their answer than in their reasons for giving it, and over the course of decades, he noticed patterns in these responses. From these patterns, he concluded that moral development followed a predictable series of 6 stages across 3 broad levels: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. At the pre-conventional level, generally associated with children, the reasoning was totally self-interested, concerned only with the possibility of punishment and self-preservation. However, at the next level, the reasoning shifted to social approval and utility. This was the level that marked the normal adult moral development shared by most people, and I think that we could reasonably say that this is what Essel and Arthur mean when they talk about goodness. Goodness is what is available to everyone, which is why it is generally expected of everyone. No one is going to be mad at you for failing to be great. Well, except your Nietzschean surrogate father figure, he might get a little mad. But on the whole, failing to achieve greatness is seen as normal. Most people never even think about trying to achieve greatness, and nobody faults them for it. But people can reasonably criticize someone for failing to be good, and this is because the demands of goodness are not terribly steep. While goodness does imply prohibitions on egotism and self-interest, this is always done kind of with a wink and a nod. Things like lying, cheating, and stealing are all censured because people within a community are presumed to have certain obligations to one another. But it's also accepted that goodness in these situations doesn't require a person to totally sacrifice their interests or egos either. Altruism is of course looked on favorably, and altruistic people are considered morally superior to self-interested people, but it's not strictly required, and it's taken largely for granted that people will pursue their own desires and satisfactions. And good people themselves aren't moral paragons. They're just good. They generally do the right thing, not because they've spent years weighing the different moral theories and forged deep commitments to this or that action, but out of conditioning, or because they might face social ostracism otherwise. And finally, a good society is one in which goodness is easy and justified by the benefits that it creates. When things are going well and there is a high level of conformity to these accepted standards of goodness, then the individual's sacrifice to be good is never too demanding, and it creates a positive feedback loop of material and social benefits. This was, in its essence, what good meant to the moral utilitarians of the 18th century. David Hume, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, as well as those like Herbert Spencer, who claimed that the concept of goodness came into being to describe altruistic actions that benefited society. But what about greatness? In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche took issue with the social utilitarians by pointing out that the historical account given by those like Spencer was simply wrong on the facts, that the egotistic altruistic distinction was not actually present in the original uses of the word good. Rather, it referred to the noble, mighty, highly placed, and high-minded, as opposed to what was base, low-minded, and plebeian. According to Nietzsche, the good was historically associated with what was powerful and aristocratic, the man who followed his will to power and his desire for glory. The ancient Greeks had a word, thymos, which meant something like spiritedness or courage, but was also associated with self-respect and the desire for recognition. Their word, agathos, is the closest approximation in Greek to our word good, but in its earliest uses, it did not refer to any moral qualities. Rather, it was used to describe excellence, skill, and power, as in the cases of great heroes like Achilles. What emerges from these contemplations is the idea of the man who is driven by an egotistical desire for glory and to be recognized as superior, Nietzsche's notorious will to power. This Nietzschean type is notably amoral, or, to borrow a phrase from the man himself, beyond good and evil. And this idea seems to be what Essel has in mind when she talks about greatness, and this too bears some similarity to the way that we see the concept being used today, in which it simply refers to people who are powerful. In recent years, we've learned perhaps more than we ever wanted to know about what the most powerful people in our world get up to behind closed doors. But the critical question is whether this is what Arthur means when he uses the same word, and I don't believe that it is. In addition to the 2 previously mentioned levels of moral development, Kohlberg also posited a third, which he called post-conventional morality. According to Kohlberg, only a small minority, as little as 15%, ever reached this stage of moral reasoning in their lives. At the highest stage, the individual ceased to be concerned with social influences and even the law. Instead, they were motivated by a commitment to abstract principles and ideals. This commitment went far beyond the pro-social or utilitarian instincts of the majority. It might even lead the individual into conflict with their surrounding society and even invite social disapprobation. To me, it seems obvious that this is what Arthur is referring to when he talks about greatness, that it is something that is morally superior to goodness. When understood through this lens, The Green Knight can be seen as a story of one man journeying through these different different moral postures, and his various encounters are meant to test him in different ways. The first of these encounters occurs shortly after Gawain has set out on his quest. He comes to a clearing in which some great battle had previously been fought. The ground is littered with corpses, and among them wanders a young man who is scavenging their remains. As they talk, the scavenger tells Gawain that supposedly the king himself had fought here, killing 960 men single-handedly. Many commenters have used the scene as a way of undermining Arthur's supposed virtue or legitimacy. Hey, look how he said that his knights had brought peace to his kingdom. Well, look here, this doesn't seem very peaceful. And in this respect, they are simply echoing Lowery himself, who has said that he intended for the scene to cut against the image of Arthur as a peacebringer. Unfortunately, if that is the intended goal of the scene, it doesn't do it very well. For those of us who don't live inside Disney movies, the way that you bring peace is by ending conflict, and one perfectly valid way of ending conflicts is by winning them. The idea that the side of the battle outside of Arthur's kingdom would undermine his credibility is already tenuous, but it becomes ridiculous when we realize what historical event Lowery is referring to here. The 960 men figure is a clear reference to the historical Battle of Baden between the British and the Saxons, and the account comes from the 19th century Historia Brittonum, in which Arthur is described as one of the generals, not yet a king, and it is claimed that he killed 960 men on his own. And this defensive war was fought because Anglo-Saxon forces had been steadily encroaching on British lands. So any way you slice it, the toxic masculinity, war man bad angle here is painfully inappropriate. If that was Lowery's design, then it represents a failure on his part. There's nothing about this that is specifically condemnatory of Arthur or his kingdom. However, it does present a more significant challenge to the concept of honor itself. In certain respects, the Battle of Baden is where Arthur's legend begins, where he first meets greatness. But for hundreds of others, it was the place where they lost their lives, to rot unburied under the baking sun. When Gawain passes through, he's at the start of his own quest, and his own pursuit of greatness, and what he is confronted with is the aftermath of Arthur's legend. A field of corpses being looted by a dishonorable thug. The scene is immediately demoralizing. It seems to give vindication to Essel and to reflect the words of Gawain himself from earlier versions of the script, who pointed out the foolishness of getting oneself killed from someone else's war. Though each of these men thought that they were marching for glory, they all ended up food for the worms. And it begs the question of what honor is worth if it fills up fields with corpses like this. The concept of duty is implicitly subjected to a utilitarian critique in which it appears like a fool's errand. To modify a phrase from Anton Chigurh, whatever rule could bring one to this is a useless rule. And the scavenger offers Gawain a bit of dubious advice, suggesting that he knows a shortcut to a chapel that will knock several days off the journey. There's not much assurance that it's even the right chapel though. It's much too close, and the boy describes it as greenish and says it might be what you seek. And Gawain's willingness to follow such unconvincing directions kind of indicates that he's looking for a plausible justification to failure. You can just imagine him returning to Arthur and saying, look, I went to a greenish chapel and there was nobody there. How was I supposed to know it wasn't the green chapel? I wasn't exactly given the most precise directions. And sure, everyone might be disappointed by this outcome to the story, but they wouldn't really be able to lay it on Gawain. So he takes the boy's shortcut, but shortly afterwards, he's waylaid by the same boy and a couple of his partners, and they tie Gawain up, and the bandit, played by Berac, takes the axe and says to him, I'll finish your quest for you, before riding off on his horse. There's a clear moral logic at work here. The would-be hero makes a dishonorable choice and receives his karmic punishment for it. The thieves leave Gawain tied up in the woods, and as he lies there, he has a vision in which he sees himself as a decayed corpse surrounded by verdant green. The vision galvanizes Gawain into action. He cuts himself free on his sword, but in doing so he slashes his hand, and the camera shows a close-up of the blood as it spurts over his hands, prefiguring the later speech by Lady Berac about the dualism of green and red and the forces represented by each. Maybe the most obvious thematic aspect of the Green Knight is the way that it uses its various color palettes. Green and red are of course the most forward-facing of these, and their meaning is explicitly covered in the lady's speech. Green represents nature, but also death, entropy, and decay. Red is the color of blood, of lust and desire, even the lust for life and the desire for glory. And previously in the film, when Gawain had confronted the Green Knight, as he leapt over the table, he had knocked over a cup of red wine. The connection should be obvious. These two forces are locked in eternal struggle, but green always emerges victorious. After he frees himself, Gawain makes his way to a seemingly abandoned cottage where he meets Saint Winifred. She tells him that another lord came to her cottage seeking shelter and eventually tried to sleep with her, and she even suggests that that might have been Gawain himself. When Gawain leaps into the pond to retrieve her head, he's initially confused, but there is a hard switch from green to red lighting, and he hears his name called as he seems to see a vision of the cosmos. It's a very weird moment, but it suggests that Gawain is being appealed to by an ideal of his own legend echoing into eternity. And when he rises from the pond with Winifred's skull, instead of seeing her, he sees, for the first time, the red fox, the embodiment of his fledgling legend, his self-love, and his lust for life. He returns Winifred's head to her body, but receives no reward. When he wakes in the morning, he sees the green axe which had been stolen by the bandit, bathed in the golden light of the dawn. There's a third primary color that is not explicitly treated by the film, and is often ignored when people talk about this movie: gold. I think the reason for the relative scarcity of discussion of this color is because it is handled more subtly than the others. The gold lighting is almost always diegetic, and there's no explicit discussion of its meaning, as there is for red and green. The viewer is largely left to their own devices and must discover this element on their own through its associations. For instance, Arthur is often backlit with a golden light, and the cloak that Gawain is given for his quest is a bright golden orange. And then there's the axe. Taken together and with examples coming from later in the movie, it seems to represent nobility and higher callings. The point here isn't just that the axe has been restored to Gawain, his quest has been restored as well. And after his encounter with Winifred, Gawain and the Red Fox make their way through the land, eventually arriving at the house of the unnamed Lord and Lady. Well, they're unnamed in the movie, but from the poem we know that this is the home of Lord Berac. When he first arrives at the castle, Gawain is so exhausted from his journey that he faints immediately after entering. When he wakes, he finds the Lord of the house sitting beside him, and the Lord assures him that he is safe and that the Green Chapel is very close, and that his quest is practically at an end. He and his wife encourage Gawain to rest and gather his strength. Though they seem nice enough, there's something uncanny and maybe even a little sinister about the place. The Lord assures Gawain to relax and that the chapel is less than a day's travel away, and he tells him that he can leave on Christmas morning and arrive at the chapel before nightfall. But there's something a little off about his plan. First of all, it seems to take the whole situation pretty lightly. Maybe the knight is expecting him on Christmas morning, but the Lord, who claims to have deep knowledge of Gawain and his quest, treats the situation as if it was a 24-hour window or something. Also, this plan assumes that Gawain will not encounter any serious setbacks or interruptions on his travels, but up to this point, his journey has been nothing but interruptions and setbacks. It's as if Gawain is being encouraged to take a course of action that's designed to get him to delay long enough that he can miss the appointment, and then blame it on poor planning or a lack of luck or really anything rather than cowardice. As with the thief, Gawain is being given an opportunity to covertly sabotage his quest. As he walks around the house, Gawain comes across a painting depicting a knight and his entourage chasing a red fox. It's interesting to see something very much like the thing that Gawain is doing represented as an object of art, and the implication seems to be that this place is somehow removed from this lust for life and fame and ambition that is driving Gawain. Here, the struggles and pursuits of life can be held at distance and examined intellectually or artistically, rather than actually being lived. The things that matter to and motivate Gawain are simply intellectual baubles for Lady Berac to examine and deconstruct, and ultimately what she succeeds in deconstructing is Gawain's inchoate virtue. Inchoate? Is it inchoate or inchoate?
Inchoate.
I want it.
You are not knight.
Inchoate.
Gawain leaves in a hurry and encounters the Lord one last time as he is setting off. Previously, the two men had made a pledge that if Gawain received any gifts inside of the Lord's castle, he would give them to the Lord. The Lord asks Gawain if there's anything that he received during his stay that he would like to share. But when Gawain refuses Berac, he gives him a different gift, releasing the red fox again, symbolizing Gawain's return to his pursuit of glory and his ambitions. As Gawain nears his destination, the scenery changes and is suffused with a golden glow all around him. And it is at this moment that the fox stops him and suddenly speaks with a human voice that sounds like his mother's, telling him to turn around. Throughout the movie, there's been ambiguity about Gawain's motivations. Is he driven by pursuit of glory and recognition, or does he truly want honor as he says? Up until now, both of those drives have been pointed in the same direction, but as Gawain nears the site of the challenge, the fox that has been his companion since he retrieved St. Winifred's skull, and who represents his thymotic desire for glory, tries to dissuade him. The lust for life and life's ambitions cannot rationally lead a person to willingly accept their death. Gawain's desire for honor tells him to go forward, but his desire for every other good thing in life pleads with him to turn back. And the fox says that if any man truly understood what he bargained against death, then he would lie and bear his shame gladly. As it has been at so many points during the course of this film, Gawain's commitment to his oath is tested. Gawain says that he won't be turned aside and that he is no coward, but the fox points out that the protective sash around his waist says differently. Take it off, the fox tells him. But Gawain refuses, eventually chasing off the fox and proceeding to the chapel. Once there, he finds the Green Knight unresponsive, sitting in a kind of trance. He sits and waits through the night as he gazes at the knight, and he has a vision in which the knight's face seems to morph into other faces. He sees his mother, Berac, Arthur, and even himself. All of these people, all of these forces that have seemed to be working at cross ends were actually working in unison to bring Gawain to this moment, the cusp of greatness, an encounter with something transcendent. In the original poem, the Green Knight is finally revealed to be Lord Berac in disguise. He's merely a man who's been enhanced by Morgana's sorcery. But here, he is something far more significant. The Green Knight invites Gawain to fulfill his part of the bargain, but at the critical moment, Gawain flinches and ultimately flees, emerging from the chapel to find that his horse has returned to him. And in a dreamlike sequence, he returns to the kingdom to be knighted by Arthur and ultimately take the throne. After his return, Gawain has a child with Essel. But when it is born, he takes it and leaves her with only a handful of coins, just like he's always done, leaving her to live in shame and obscurity. Afterwards, he marries a young and beautiful queen with blazing red hair. We see them lying in bed, presumably after coitus, and the young queen doesn't look too pleased, but Gawain also doesn't seem to care. He gazes at a painting of a creature reminiscent of the fox, but with a human face. And this seems to be a reference to another folkloric entity called the questing beast, a creature who represents lust, violence, degeneracy, and ultimately plays a role in the fall of Arthur's kingdom in the legends, and it's appropriate to see it now. Having failed the test of the ethical, Gawain now devotes himself to his own vanity, like any corrupt king. And as the scene continues, Gawain's kingdom falls into decline, and the color green creeps in, just like Lady Berac said it would. Lowery stated in an interview that he saw the film as a battle between civilization and nature, but I find it more apt to frame it as a battle between order and entropy. The purpose of greatness, honor, idealism, etc., the reason why these things matter is that only these are capable of forging order out of chaos. Only these are capable of pushing back the tide of green and decay, and they are represented by gold. In the montage, the presence of green grows, slowly tinting each scene a little more than the last. But there are moments when the dominance of green is broken, moments when it is gold that creeps in. Gold fills the screen when Gawain's son dies, sacrificing himself heroically in battle. And as the troops of some rival kingdom invade Gawain's demoralized Camelot, a golden light is seen seeping into the green of the throne room. And it is at this moment that Gawain removes the green girdle and his head falls from his shoulders, as if he had actually taken the blow from the knight all those years ago. I find it interesting that David Lowery's story is effectively the opposite of the one portrayed in the original poem. The Gawain of the poem is an ideal knight, whose conduct throughout the story is basically immaculate. Ultimately, the Green Knight reveals himself to be Lord Berac, and also reveals that his wife's attempted seduction was a test of Gawain's knightly virtue, and one that he failed by not giving up the belt. Gawain admits his mistake and basically says that the entire episode has reminded him that all virtue comes from God alone, and the two men part as friends. Gawain returns home bearing the green girdle as a token of his shame, but when he tells his story, all the other knights begin wearing green belts as well, showing that they recognize that even Gawain's ability to acknowledge his failures is something honorable and worth emulating. The lesson that Gawain learns on his quest is not the importance of virtue, but his own frailty and need for humility. He's reminded that even a great man is still just a man. But Lowery's Gawain makes the opposite journey, through a different series of revolutions, and each of these represents a different posture that a man can take towards the world in his own life. The first of these postures is the passive hedonic man represented by Gawain at the story's beginning. And the flaw in this life is that it is hollow and sterile. It produces nothing of worth and ends in total moral collapse. Gawain is pulled out of this mentality by his desire for something better and by his will to survive, provoking him into the second posture, the Nietzschean man of action who embraces life and pursues his ambitions. However, the infiltration of green seen in Gawain's premonition reveals that this posture too is ultimately futile. And what about goodness? We can imagine a version of Gawain's life in which he is merely good. In this life, he quits the brothels and the taverns and takes Essel as a wife, or at least stops leading her on. Maybe he starts taking knighthood seriously, and eventually succeeds in becoming a knight and living out the rest of his days as a knight like all the others. He becomes a well-integrated member of the social body. But even if he were to become a knight, at the moment when it mattered most, when their lord's legacy was at stake, those other knights failed to rise and defend it. And this is the failure of goodness, what highlights the need for something beyond goodness. To return to the scene in which Essel argued that goodness ought to be enough, it's worth remembering what she is encouraging Gawain to do in that moment. The pressure that Arthur is putting on Gawain in that moment is for him to keep his oath, and it's Essel who's trying to get him to break that oath. She isn't acting on the side of virtue or morality, any more than Gawain's mother is when she gives him the charmed girdle. She's advocating for self-preservation, something perfectly acceptable by the lower standard of goodness. But that standard ultimately fails too, and the point of the ending montage is to show that something more is needed. If the point of that montage, and the film itself, as many have suggested, was simply to show that death comes for all of us anyway, that would be merely trivial. Everyone knows that they have to die. If this were the only lesson the film had to teach, then Gawain might as well have let himself die in the woods at the beginning. But he didn't. Instead, he was driven to avoid that death because of his love for life. But a life lived without ideals eventually reveals its own futility. The purpose of the vision that Gawain receives is to prove to him that futility of a life lived without honor. And the outcome of the vision is that he's able to submit his life for the sake of duty, realizing that the demands of duty are absolute, even when made in a game. That is the nature of greatness. Greatness is what is able to journey outside of the established area of social order into spaces that are not mediated by social forms and accepted rules. It is what establishes the order that makes goodness possible. Greatness is that which goes into the unknown to contend with something absolute. The absolute has been envisioned in many ways, be it God or some immaterial or impersonal force, but it is fundamentally inhuman, just as the Green Knight is inhuman. And through the film's blending of these ideas, it gives us an understanding of what a hero actually is. The hero is the man of action, filled with the vigor of life, who's able to sacrifice himself to an ideal. And looking back through history, we find that this willingness to stand by one's beliefs, even in the face of death, has always been what set the great apart from those who merely wish to live. In his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, Václav Havel portrayed his famous green grocer, living in communist Czechoslovakia. In his shop window hangs a sign proclaiming, "Workers of the world unite." And Havel asks whether he really has hung this sign from an effusion of solidarity with the ruling communist regime. I think it can safely be assumed that the overwhelming majority of shopkeepers never think about the slogans they put in their windows, nor do they use them to express their real opinions. He put them all into the window simply because it has been done that way for years, because everyone does it, and because that is the way it has to be. If he were to refuse, there could be trouble. He could be reproached for not having the proper decoration in his window. Someone might even accuse him of disloyalty. He does it because these things must be done if one is to get along in life. It is one of the thousands of details that guarantee him a relatively tranquil life in harmony with society, as they say. And in the atrocities of the 20th century, one was able to see how societies filled with quote-unquote good people could be turned into living nightmares. In contrast, one of the most poignant expressions of heroism can be found in Sophie Scholl, a German college student and a member of the White Rose anti-Nazi group, who wrote, "The real damage is done by those millions who want to survive, the honest men who just want to be left in peace, those who don't want their little lives disturbed by anything bigger than themselves, those with no sides and no causes, those who won't take measure of their own strength for fear of antagonizing their own weakness, those who don't like to make waves or enemies. Those for whom freedom, honor, truth, and principles are only literature. Those who live small, mate small, die small." It's the reductionist approach to life. If you keep it small, you'll keep it under control. If you don't make any noise, the boogeyman won't find you. But it's all an illusion, because they die too. Those people who roll up their spirits into tiny little balls so as to be safe. True greatness isn't about fame or glory, though it sometimes overlaps with those. It isn't even about accomplishment. In the end, greatness is about what one is willing to sacrifice for their ideals. After his vision, Gawain removes the green belt and kneels once more in front of the knight. But the knight spares him. People sometimes claim that the movie is ambiguous on this point. It isn't at all. I don't know how it could be any clearer short of putting up a title card that says, "And then Gawain left and went back and did whatever." But in the original version of the script, Gawain isn't spared. Lowry said that he wanted to write a story in which Gawain actually dies, and that's a good thing. But he ultimately feared how audiences would react to that ending and so chose to soften it. But I think the original intention serves to show the intensity and seriousness of what Lowry wanted to bring to this sacrifice. And this is not goodness. Goodness does not demand that a person lay down their life to fulfill an oath they made in a game. In many stories, the hero initially finds that he is unable to fit himself into the society that surrounds him, unable to meet the demands of goodness simply because they seem hollow to him. And it's this dissatisfaction that eventually leads him out into the unknown where, hopefully, he comes face to face with the thing that can make his life and his suffering meaningful. And if I'm being honest, I feel like I have a little bit of a personal investment in these kinds of stories. Without oversharing, I lost my faith in mere goodness when I was very young, and for most of my life, I felt like I was just wandering without any clear destination, hoping that somehow I'd find some way to make sense of it, to arrive at some place where I could see what it had all been for, the pain I'd suffered, the damage I'd inflicted, and even the beauty that I'd found. And hell, maybe I even wanted to be tested too. Not that I think that I'm some moral paragon or that I believe that I could pass that particular audit, but regardless, I've wanted it. I still want it. But in our hyper-real postmodern world where everything is either for sale or entirely fake, it's hard to imagine what ideal is left that could demand that kind of commitment. And where the Green Knight succeeds is in making us aware that somehow everything depends on this act of sacrifice, and that anything less is bound for decay and death. And in watching it, it is natural to feel challenged or even inferior. It's natural to hear some internal voice ask, Could you do it? And when we suspect that the answer is no, we're tempted to avert our heads and try to pretend we didn't hear the question. And this too is a deep truth about humanity. The mediocre man will often deny the existence of the great so he can avoid being measured against that standard. Psychologically, this allows him to preserve his ego and ignore his failings, casting the great man as the arrogant and egotistical man, whereas he, the good man, is humble and decent. And when people try to make this film an ode to goodness, which so many have, they similarly flatter themselves and their vanity, cutting away or distorting the elements of the story that so obviously cut against everything they stand for, all so that they can avoid the challenging truth that lies at the heart of this film, that when it matters most, only the great truly know what it means to be good. Hi guys, if you made it this far, I just want to say thanks for watching. If you're new here, please consider liking and leaving a comment, and maybe even subscribing. It does help the channel grow. This is all a one-man operation, and these take me a long time to make, so any support is greatly appreciated. I know that's a cliche to say, but it really is the truth. I'm already finished with the script and recording for the next video. It's going to be a critical examination of the book Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I've always envisioned this as a channel about exploring ideas, and sometimes film is the medium that makes the most sense for that, but not always. So if you're interested in that, just keep an eye out. I'm hoping to be putting it out in the next couple of weeks. That said, thanks once again for watching, and take care of yourself.